The Whispering Rift. Location: White Mountain National Forest, New Hampshire. Approximate year: 2002. My daughter never went farther than the entrance of the granite rift. The other children could still see her standing there. Then she disappeared directly in front of them. She did not walk into the darkness. She did not turn the corner. She did not fall. She simply vanished. 3 minutes later, she appeared in exactly the same place and continued speaking as though no time had passed between two words. She insisted she had never gone anywhere. By the next morning, she knew something she could not possibly have known, exactly what the rift had done to my brother 22 years earlier. This happened in August of 2002 when I was 34 years old. I am 58 now, and after all these years, I still do not know where my daughter went during those 3 minutes. The first time I saw the rift, I was 12. My older brother Daniel was 14. We spent most of the summer of 1980 at our grandmother's house outside a small town north of Lincoln, New Hampshire. The house stood at the end of a gravel road. Beyond the old apple orchard, the forest climbed toward the White Mountains. We could reach the first trails by bicycle in about 10 minutes. The local kids had a few places they liked to show newcomers, but the farthest was the one they called the Whispering Rift. To reach it, you followed an abandoned logging road uphill, then left it for dense evergreen forest. The last few hundred yards barely had a trail. Wet roots crossed the ground. Gray granite pushed through the soil. Old needles softened every step. The closer we got, the quieter the forest became. First the insects disappeared, then the birds. Eventually there was nothing except wind high in the canopy and the occasional knock of a pine cone hitting the ground. The rift lay at the base of a granite outcrop. 2 enormous rounded faces of granite projected from the slope beneath spruce, moss, and roots. Between them ran an almost vertical black fissure. In 1980, it was only 8 or 10 inches wide. The passage angled inward, and our flashlights showed perhaps 15 or 20 feet of damp gray walls before it bent downward into darkness. What made the place famous was the sound. If you leaned toward the opening and spoke, the rift gave your voice back several seconds later. But it was never a normal echo. The pitch dropped. Certain sounds stretched. Sometimes the final syllable continued after the echo should have died. The first time I tried it, I shouted my own name. "Matthew!" Several seconds later, something deep inside the mountain answered. "Matthew." It was my voice, but old and exhausted, as if it came from far below us. A local boy named Wes Calder told us that was why everyone called it the Whispering Rift. He also knew an old story. According to his grandfather, a small seasonal native settlement had once existed near the ridge, long before the nearest modern towns. Nobody knew exactly who had lived there. The story said only that they considered the place dangerous. They had not worshipped the rift. They had been trying to keep something from coming through it. Along the edges of the fissure were lines so worn that they could easily be mistaken for natural fractures. On the left was a long, curved groove. On the right was another, almost its mirror image. Seen straight on, the marks resembled 2 narrow loops facing one another. The black fissure itself seemed to form the missing connection between them. Near the narrowest point was a small circular depression that stayed dark even in direct sunlight. At 12 years old, the symbol interested me less than what the rift did to objects. We threw in a stone. It struck the walls, went silent, then shot back out. Daniel blamed the slope. A pine cone and a bottle cap came back too, but the delay was never the same, sometimes 2 seconds, sometimes 10. I had an old brass compass that had belonged to our grandfather. I had been specifically told not to lose it, which was probably why, at 12, I decided it would be impressive to throw it into the fissure. The compass struck stone twice and disappeared. 5 seconds passed. 10. 15. We had just decided it was stuck when it came flying out hard enough to hit Daniel in the chest. The casing was undamaged. but the needle turned slowly in circles, then stopped. It was not pointing north. It pointed directly at the rift. We walked 50 yards away. The needle rotated and kept pointing back toward the granite. By the next day, the brass had turned almost black. The following morning, part of the casing crumbled between my fingers. I buried what remained behind our grandmother's shed. A few days later, we went back. It was a warm, clear morning, and our grandmother had packed apples and sandwiches because we planned to stay in the woods most of the day. Near the rift were broad granite slabs heated by the sun. We sat there and ate. Daniel still had one green apple. Without much discussion, he rolled it into the opening. We heard a few soft impacts, then nothing. 20 seconds, 30, almost a minute. The apple appeared in the darkness and rolled slowly into the light. At first I thought it was a different one. The skin was shriveled and dark. One side was covered in white frost. I touched it. It was ice cold, even though the granite around us was hot from the sun. Daniel cut the apple open. There were no seeds. The entire core was packed with fine gray sand. We did not throw anything else into the rift that day. For several days, nobody suggested going back. Then Scout followed us. Scout was Wes's young beagle, noisy and curious and afraid of almost nothing. He ran through ferns, carried sticks, and circled us all the way up the old road. When we reached the granite, the forest went silent again. Scout seemed not to notice. Daniel threw him a branch. It struck the rock beside the opening. Scout ran after it, stopped at the fissure, and sniffed the air. Wes called him. He did not react. Scout pushed his muzzle inside, then his head, his shoulders, his front legs. We still did not understand how he fit through something so narrow. Wes grabbed for his hind legs, but Scout twisted free and vanished. For several seconds we heard claws scraping stone, then one short yelp. After that came another sound, much farther away than the visible passage could possibly allow. Then silence. We lay beside the crack and called him. Daniel tied a flashlight to a cord and lowered it inside. The beam slid across wet granite, reached the bend, and disappeared. After a while, I heard barking. Very faint. I leaned closer. The bark came again, only now it did not quite sound like a dog. It was lower and stretched, almost like the rift's distorted echo. 18 minutes after Scout vanished, he crawled back out. His fur was dry, his paws were clean, and he was not injured, but his collar was gone. Wes hugged him. Scout did not respond. He only stared back at the fissure. For the next 3 days, Scout barely ate and stopped barking. He spent hours on the porch facing the mountains and growled at his reflection in the glass door. On the 4th night, he tore through the porch screen and disappeared. Rain had fallen overnight, so we found his tracks easily the next morning. They led straight through the forest to the granite outcrop and ended at the fissure. There were no tracks leading away. We never saw Scout again. Wes told his parents the dog had run into the woods after a scent. None of us mentioned the rift. At that age, keeping the place secret still seemed more important than explaining what had happened. Scout's collar was visible just inside the opening. Daniel thought he could reach it. He lay on his stomach and pushed his left arm into the fissure. I watched his fingers touch the collar. Then he screamed. His arm would not move. The granite itself remained perfectly still. Nothing collapsed. The fissure did not close. But Daniel shouted that something was squeezing his arm from every direction. Wes and I pulled him by the shoulders. Nothing. Daniel said the pressure was moving upward from his hand toward his elbow. Then a second scream came from inside the mountain. Daniel's exact voice. Delayed, lower, much longer. I still remember the moment the real Daniel stopped screaming because he heard himself screaming from somewhere deeper inside the rock. For 1 second, all of us froze, and the rift released him. We fell backward. For perhaps 2 minutes, Daniel could not move his left arm. Then his fingers began to respond, and by the time we were halfway home, he could move it normally again. There was no blood, bruise, or pressure mark. We told our grandmother he had gotten his arm wedged between two rocks near the old logging road. Because it was working normally again, she assumed he had compressed a nerve. The strange symptoms came gradually. Daniel could feel touch, but his brain interpreted it incorrectly. Hard objects sometimes felt soft. Cold could feel hot, and warmth could feel icy. His strength and movement were normal. His sense of touch was not. Doctors found no structural damage. One neurologist called it a psychogenic sensory disturbance, what today might be described as a functional sensory disorder, and blamed the combination of pressure, fear, and stress. Most of it improved, but the temperature reversals and brief distortions of texture never completely disappeared. Several months after the accident, something else appeared. One cold morning, a pale pattern formed beneath the skin of Daniel's forearm. Two curved lines, a narrow gap between them, a small point in the center. The same shape as the carving on the rift. It lasted less than 2 minutes. Daniel showed our parents. A dermatologist thought the pattern might be vascular, caused by temporary changes in small blood vessels or abnormal nerve signals. He could not explain why the same geometry returned in the same place and suggested we were seeing a meaningful shape in a random vascular pattern. Our parents accepted that. Daniel and I did not. Because his arm worked normally and the symptoms had appeared gradually, nobody had a reason to hike into the forest to inspect the exact place. We certainly did not volunteer to take them there. After that summer, Daniel never returned to the rift. Neither did I. 22 years passed. Over time, I learned to explain almost everything. Childhood memory is unreliable. Mountains create strange acoustics. Scout could have run away. Daniel could have had an unusual stress-related sensory disorder. Even the compass and the apple slowly became less like evidence and more like memories that frightened me. Then our grandmother died in the spring of 2002. That August, I returned to New Hampshire with my wife Claire and our 9-year-old daughter, Emily. We planned to sort through the old house and prepare it for sale. Daniel said he would join us near the weekend. The place seemed smaller than I remembered. The orchard was overgrown, and the forest had pushed closer to the road. But the mountains looked the same. Blue ridges behind spruce, gray granite, morning fog, and that smell after rain, wet bark, pine needles, and cold stone. Emily quickly met several local children. I never warned her about the rift. By then, I had spent 22 years convincing myself that frightened children had turned an unusual place into something impossible. I also assumed the old trail had vanished and that local kids no longer knew about it. One afternoon, Claire let Emily go exploring with them, with instructions not to go beyond the old logging road and to return before dinner. They left around 2. By 4, they were still gone. At 4:30, I found one of their bicycles lying near an old trail that disappeared into the trees. And I knew. There was no evidence. I simply knew where they had gone. I started running. The air beneath the trees was colder than near the house. Water still fell from branches after an earlier rain. Mist clung to the upper slope. The farther I went, the stronger the old sensation returned. The silence, that same silence. The children came out of the trees before I reached the ridge. Emily looked completely normal. The other 3 did not. One boy was crying. A girl kept looking over her shoulder. They had been to the rift. In 22 years, it had widened enough for a child to step partly inside. Emily had gone closer than the others, but she had taken only one careful step into the opening. They could still see her back, arms, and legs. The bend in the passage remained well beyond her. Emily said she wanted to hear the echo from inside. Then something below made a sound like a slow breath. Long, deep, as though the mountain itself had inhaled. The light around Emily changed. The children were certain the forest did not become darker. The sun did not disappear behind clouds. Only Emily seemed farther away. The colors of her clothes faded. Her outline became less distinct, as though a great distance had opened between them, even though she was only a few feet away. She said, "That's strange. I can hear you from the other side, too." and vanished. She did not move deeper into the crack. She did not slip behind the wall. One moment she was there. The next, the entrance was empty. The children called her name. Their voices returned, stretched and distorted. 3 minutes later, Emily appeared on the same step, in the same position, and finished the sentence she had begun before disappearing. "Even though all of you are standing right in front of me." She could not understand why the others were screaming. For her, nothing had happened. When I questioned her later, she insisted she had never gone anywhere. She had never moved beyond the entrance. For a moment, she said, the other children simply looked very far away, but she could still see them. Those 3 minutes did not exist for her. That evening, I found fine gray grains beside her sneakers. I emptied one shoe over a newspaper. A small amount of gray sand fell out, the same color as the material inside the apple 22 years earlier. I said nothing to Claire. There was about an hour of daylight left, and I went to the rift alone. The slope had changed. Old spruce trees had fallen, and moss had retreated from the granite. The two rounded faces of rock were more exposed, narrowing toward the dark opening. The markings along the edges were clearer too, one loop on the left, another on the right, both curving toward the blackness. I stepped farther back and saw the whole formation at once. The rock itself resembled an enormous version of the symbol. When we were children, roots and moss had hidden that resemblance. Now I could not tell which possibility was worse, that somebody had carved the symbol because the formation already looked that way, or that the rift had somehow grown to resemble the carving. The sun was dropping behind the mountain. The trees had gone still. No birds, no insects. Even the wind in the treetops had stopped. I switched on my flashlight. The beam entered the fissure. Wet rock, uneven ground, the bend. Near the farthest visible point, the light seemed to weaken. It did not reflect. It did not scatter. It simply disappeared. I said my daughter's name. "Emily," the rift answered. "Emily!" I was already turning away when another voice came from inside. Not an echo. Quiet. Very close. "Dad?" It was Emily. She was at the house, almost a mile away. I did not answer. I started walking back. A branch snapped behind me, then another, farther to my right. I stopped. The forest was completely silent. From somewhere behind me came a voice. "Matt!" Then again. "Mouse! Matt!" Daniel used to call me Mouse when we were children because I was small and quiet. Nobody else had ever called me that. I ran. When I reached the house, Emily was sitting calmly on the porch with Claire. At dinner, she stared at the kitchen wall and said the house seemed smaller on the inside than it was on the outside. Later, as she passed me without looking my way, she quietly said, "Matt? Mouse." When I asked what she had said, she looked confused. The next morning, Daniel arrived. Emily walked to him, took his left hand, then touched the exact place on his forearm where the pale pattern sometimes appeared. "Does it still show up here?" Daniel looked at me. That was something we had never told Claire. We had never told Emily. After lunch, Daniel and I walked toward the ridge. He stopped before the outcrop and refused to go farther. "It got bigger," he said. His left hand began to tremble. He pressed his fingers against a tree and said the bark felt soft. At the same moment, the pale pattern appeared beneath his skin. Then barking came from the rift. One short sound. Several seconds later, another, weak and distant, as though a dog were somewhere deep inside the mountain. Daniel turned around. We left New Hampshire the following morning. Later, I contacted the Forest Service and reported the fissure as a dangerous feature near an unofficial trail. 2 employees inspected it and described a natural vertical joint extending about 19 feet before bending out of sight. The report said nothing about the symbol. I called and asked whether they were certain they had inspected the same formation, 2 rounded granite faces with a vertical fissure between them. They confirmed it. When I asked about the curved carvings along the edges, the man paused. "There were no symbols on the rock," he said. "Emily grew up normally. She went to school, made friends, laughed, and never behaved like a child who had become someone else. But occasionally, she said, rooms felt the wrong size." Once, late at night, I heard her voice in the hallway. "Dad." Emily was asleep in her room. As I turned away from her door, the same voice whispered somewhere behind me, "Not this way." It did not happen often. Sometimes a year passed without anything strange. Claire and I took Emily to child psychologists more than once. They found no significant distress, no loss of contact with reality, and no reason for psychiatric treatment. She was a healthy child. I wanted to believe that meant the rift had left nothing behind. When Emily was 16, we were driving at night in heavy rain. Lightning flashed beyond the dark hills. She was watching the forest through the passenger window when she said, "The rift isn't getting wider, Dad." I asked what she meant. "We're getting closer to it." A few seconds later, she looked at me and did not remember saying either sentence. Years afterward, I found a popular science article about space-time, black holes, and hypothetical wormholes. One illustration showed a simplified Einstein-Rosen bridge, two curved regions facing one another, connected through a narrow throat with a point at the center. It was not identical to the carving in New Hampshire, but it was close enough. I closed the magazine and never returned to the article. Mostly I closed it because the resemblance brought back my guilt. I had brought Emily to that house and failed to keep her away from the one place I should have remembered. The psychologists had told us she was fine. I wanted to believe them. I still do. I am not claiming there was a wormhole in New Hampshire. I am not claiming that whoever carved those marks long before our time understood modern physics. But the article changed the way I saw the symbol. As children, we assumed the two curved shapes represented the two physical walls of granite. What if they did not? What if they represented two different places, two regions of space? What if the widening fissure was not separating those two sides? What if it was the connection forming between them? That was when Emily's words began to make a different kind of sense. The rift isn't getting wider. We're getting closer to it. Maybe the most important part of the carving had never been the two loops. Maybe it was the darkness between them, the rift itself. Daniel is 60 now. His arm works normally, but cold can still feel hot, and hard objects can briefly feel soft. The pale pattern still appears beneath his forearm. Emily is 33, with a normal life and a home of her own. She remembers standing at the entrance, but she still does not believe she disappeared. For her, those 3 minutes do not exist. About a month ago, Emily called me shortly after midnight. At first, it sounded ordinary. She asked whether I was awake, then she went quiet. I heard faint static. "Dad," she said, "I think I finally understand what I heard back then." Then another sound appeared somewhere behind her, a low, prolonged groan. Emily stopped talking, and I heard a second voice. Also hers, but lower, stretched, as though it had traveled through hundreds of feet of stone. "The two sides are almost touching." The call ended. I called back immediately. Emily answered on the first ring, sleepy and confused. She said she had been in bed for hours and had not called me. The call was still in my history. 4 minutes and 7 seconds. The next morning, Daniel sent me a photograph of his forearm. The symbol had appeared again. But this time the two pale curves seemed closer together, and the small point in the center was almost black. I have never returned to the White Mountains. I do not know whether the rift still exists or how wide it is now. I do not know whether the old story about the native settlement was true or who carved the marks along the fissure. Sometimes I think about the Forest Service employees. Maybe they simply failed to notice the carving, or maybe, by the time they arrived, there was nothing left to see. I have also spent years thinking about Wes's old story, about people trying to keep something from coming through. Maybe we misunderstood that too. Maybe there was never anything living inside. Maybe the danger was not a creature or a spirit waiting under the mountain. Maybe they were trying to keep the rift itself from opening, not to keep two walls of granite together, to keep two other sides apart, two places that were never supposed to touch. Everything we deliberately put into the rift came back. The stones, the compass, the apple, and even Scout came back the first time. But whenever the rift returned something, it changed. And my daughter disappeared for only 3 minutes. For her, no time passed at all. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if she had taken not one step into that opening, but two. What lay beyond the bend where our flashlights could no longer reach. And more than anything else, I wonder what will happen when the two sides finally touch. This was the first story from 6 collections. Stay tuned to Mystic Wilds, to be continued.